Greetings everyone, my name is Rejnols, and today we're taking a look at terrain and terrain rules. Now in general, I mostly cover Custodes, but today we're just covering some good old core rules of 10th edition because, if you weren't aware, even Custodes are bound to follow these core rules. So today's video is all about terrain and more specifically visibility and benefit of cover. It is still something I see a lot of players get wrong, and I don't think there's anything bad about that. It can be a little bit confusing at first because there is a lot of wording and the wording can be ever so slightly different depending on where you read them or who tells you about it. So this video aims to hopefully break it down in a way that makes it easy to understand, or at the very least can serve as a guide for when you are confused. You can just look up this video, look at the examples which I will be bringing, and then from there figure out what is happening. So first and foremost, there's been some changes in 10th edition from 9th edition when it comes to terrain. First and foremost, there is only one type of cover now, which is known as benefit of cover. Now if you didn't play in 9th edition, there was also something called dense cover and heavy cover, and those things are gone, being replaced by what is essentially light cover from 9th edition. The requirements to get cover is different depending on what terrain piece you're using, but in general you have to be either partially obscured by the terrain piece, or be wholly within the terrain piece to get the benefit of cover. Now what is the benefit of cover? Well, it is very simple. Add 1 to your armor saving throw against ranged attacks to a maximum of 3+. Now when it comes to playing Warhammer 40K, it obviously depends on where you play, but assuming you play somewhere that uses the match play rules, or somewhere that, hosts tournaments or whatever, then you're generally only going to be able to see the terrain pieces known as ruins as well as barricades. Nope, not barricades, containers. I'm not even sure why I said that. Anyways, ruins and containers is what's normally used the most, and while there are other terrain pieces officially in the rules, basically no one uses them. But you can of course use barricades or craters or anything else. Another big change in 10th edition is that ruins are now on footprints. And footprints are exactly as they sound. They are the definition of the ruin. Where does it start? Where does it end? And is usually marked by being a square or a rectangle. Once again, if you have some old ruins that is on a circular base or a hexagonal base or whatever it is, that can still be used. Just know that most tournaments and most layouts will be using square and rectangle footprints to define the space of the ruin. The important thing to keep in mind when it comes to footprints is that they are essentially an invisible skyscraper. As long as nothing is within the ruin, you cannot see through this footprint. Even if the ruin on the footprint is only 2 inches tall, you should treat it as being, a skyscraper or a giant monument or whatever it is. You cannot see through it unless there is something within the terrain. In which case, some other rules matter. We will talk more about those in just a second. But footprints are basically the replacement for the obscuring rule from 9th edition. In 9th edition, ruins had the obscuration rule, which meant that if you were behind the ruin, you were basically invisible unless you had a certain amount of wounds or the Titanic keyword. But you don't have to worry about that anymore. Those rules have been changed. But if you were playing in 9th edition and are now just joining 10th edition, this is something to keep in mind. Obscuration or the obscured rule doesn't exist anymore. Now quickly before we start talking about visibility, benefit of cover, and how it works, I just quickly want to mention that there are different terrain layouts that are pre-made by third-party tournament organizers as well as Games Workshop themselves. Which one you play with is completely up to you and your gaming group. I just want to say there's nothing wrong with any layout you decide to play on. I personally mostly play on WTC layouts. That's what I started playing with, that's what I've always been playing with, and therefore, obviously, I have some thoughts about, say, the GW layout that I think is not as good as the WTC layout, but if you started with Games Workshop layouts and think the WTC layout is dumb, then that's fair. Whatever the case is, I do highly recommend that you use layouts when you play your games of 40k. It makes for a more balanced experience, and unless you're playing a crusade or a narrative battle where, you're defending the stronghold or you're caught in the middle of no man's land, then having a symmetrical layout with a decent amount of terrain just makes the game more fun. It's not very cool to go into a game with asymmetrical layout and you're playing, say, a melee army against a shooting army, the shooting army goes first, and because it's asymmetrical and you don't have a lot of place to hide, you just get shut off the board turn 1. Or the other way around. You're a shooting army, but the opponent got the side with all of the cover and can walk all the way up to your deployment zone without ever being shot at. So, I definitely highly recommend that you find some layouts to use, whether that be WTC, Games Workshop, ITC, UKTC, whatever there is. There are very many different parties that create a lot of different layouts. Use whatever you like. Alright, let's jump back into terrain rules, more specifically, benefit of cover. As I mentioned briefly earlier, benefit of cover means that you get a +1 save against ranged attacks, to a maximum of a 3-up armor save. However, something that I still see people get wrong is that something with a 2-up armor save, like Custodes, can still benefit from cover because cover applies after modifiers. So even though benefit of cover says it can only improve your save to a 3+, it can still reduce AP even if you have a 2+ save. So for example, if my Custodes are getting the benefit of cover, and I'm being shot at by something that is AP 1, we first take my save, then we modify it with the AP of the opponent's weapon, so my 2-up save goes to a 3-up save. But because benefit of cover happens after we apply the AP to the armor save, we technically negate the AP. The reason why it's worded the way it is to make sure that no one with like a 3-up armor save, like say Space Marines, can get a 2-up armor save against AP 0. So, if you have a Space Marine that gets the benefit of cover being shot at by something with AP 0, their 3-up save will not go to a 2-up save, but will remain a 3-up save. However, something with a 2-up save being shot at by an AP 1 shot will stay at a 2-up save if they have the benefit of cover. And yes, this can be a little bit hard to understand at first, but that is how the rules work. Do keep in mind though that a 4-up save against AP 0 will go to a 3-up save assuming they have the benefit of cover. It is just that a 3-up save cannot go to a 2-up save. The important part to remember is the original save of your model. Hopefully that made sense. So for now, let's move on. Now we talked about what cover does, but how do you benefit from cover? There are essentially 2 ways to benefit from cover. So let's imagine that you are trying to shoot at an enemy unit. There's 5 models in your unit and there's 5 models in the enemy unit. If all 5 of your models can see every single part of any one model in the opponent's unit, that one model does not get the benefit of cover. However, if you can only see that one model fully, and you cannot fully see the other 4 models, then those 4 models do get cover. And because your opponent decides where to allocate the saves, that means that they can decide to take the saves on the models that are benefiting from cover, or they can decide to take it on the one guy that doesn't benefit from cover. The other way to get cover is to be wholly within a terrain feature. As an example, on the image over here on the right side, you can see that I've given a check mark to 2 of the Chaos Space Marines that are wholly inside the terrain piece. These 2 models will, no matter what, get the benefit of cover, because they are wholly within the terrain piece. However, the third guy is not wholly within a terrain piece and therefore would not get the benefit of cover, assuming, as we talked about earlier, that all of the models in the unit you're shooting can fully see that model. Now, this has been a lot of talking, and I totally get if it's a little bit hard to understand, so we're gonna jump into Tabletop Simulator, where I can give you some practical examples that are hopefully a little bit easier to understand. Alright, so we are in Tabletop Simulator, and now we'll take a look at the different ways benefit of cover can apply. So, our first example is over here. You can see we have 5 custodian guards that are looking at these infiltrators over here. Now, as I set up this line here, I know it's a little bit uneven, but the point being that these 5 guys can fully see this one guy. To determine whether or not you can fully see an enemy model, you choose any one point on your model and see if that can see every single part of the enemy model. So for example, if we say this is the end of my base, I know it's not exactly correct, but let's just pretend. So this part of my base, I can drag it from this side of the model to the other side of the model without anything blocking my view. That means that I can fully see that model. Now I've lined up all my custodians to be, on the same line. So I should be able to do the exact same with the one in the back, and they can all see this one guy. Now it's time for a little quiz to see if you've been studying and following the homework assignments that I've been giving you. So my question to you is now, will this unit of infiltrators benefit from cover? If you answered yes, all of them will get the benefit of cover, you are wrong. If you answered no, none of them will get the benefit of cover, you're also wrong. Because the answer is that this one guy does not benefit from cover, but all of these guys do. That is because, as I've mentioned before, cover is determined by the attacker being able to fully see models in the enemy unit. So because none of my guys here can see any of the guys behind this wall or behind this footprint, these models get the benefit of cover. However, all of these guys can see this one guy, so he does not get the benefit of cover. So that means that if we were to pretend that I'm shooting my 10 shots of Guardian Spears into these infiltrators over here. So, let's just pretend I get 6 wounds. As we know, Guardian Spears are AP1 in shooting. So if he decides to take saves on this guy, he would have 4-up saves because he does not get the benefit of cover. However, he could decide to take the saves on the guys in cover, and so he would have a 3-up save until those 4 guys are dead. So let's just roll the dice. So in this case, he rolled a 1, 2 2s, 1 3, and 2 4s. Now, if he were taking saves on this guy, this would have killed him. However, because he was taking saves on those guys, this is just fine. So the result is that 3 guys in cover are dead, and so we remove those. Now, he could of course choose to take saves on this guy until he is dead, and then do saves on the rest afterwards. If that would be the case, let's just pretend that we rolled 1 4 and then 1 3, then this 3 would kill this guy over here, and then the remaining shots would be placed or allocated to the guys behind the wall that are still benefiting from cover. Alright, we have another example to really get the point of benefit of cover, and this is a dual purpose example. So once again, my Custodian Wardens are looking at this Redemptor Dreadnought. As you can see, I got 4 of them behind the wall or past the wall, whereas one guy was stuck behind the wall because I didn't have enough movement or, whatever. As we determined before, I can choose any one point of my model, and if I can measure from one end of my opponent's model to the other end, then I can fully see him. So that is obviously the case for these 4 models right here. Alright, time for that quiz question once again. Will this Redemptor Dreadnought get the benefit of cover against my attacks? If you answered no, he will not get the benefit of cover, you are wrong. Despite 4 of my models in the unit being able to fully see the Redemptor Dreadnought, he will get the benefit of cover against every single shot. That is because, as we mentioned earlier, benefit of cover is determined by the attacker having all of their models see any one model in the opponent's unit. So because this is a one-man unit, even if I have 4 guys who are totally able to fully see him, because I have one guy behind the wall who cannot see him, he will get the benefit of cover against every single one of my shots. Now if we go back to the infiltrator example and grab these guys, and let's throw them out like this, now things changes back to how they were before. Because now these guys can fully see these guys, but this guy still cannot do it. However, let's say these 2 guys cannot fully see this guy despite this guy being able to do it. So while I can see every single model in the unit, I cannot fully see every single model in the unit, and so this infiltrator squad would get the benefit of cover against every single shot. Because there is no one enemy model or one enemy infiltrator that every single one of my models can fully see. So yeah, we'll just take this guy, right? He can fully see all 4 of these guys, but he cannot fully see this guy. And for my guy over here, behind the wall, he can fully see this guy, but he cannot fully see any of the other guys. So in 9th edition, you would do this model by model, but in 10th edition, it is attacker unit by model. If this guy instead were over here, then the infiltrators would not get benefit of cover on these 4 guys, but would still get benefit of cover on this one guy. Once again, because my 5 models can fully see these 4 models, but my 5 models cannot fully see this one model. Obviously, this goes both ways. So this enemy dreadnought shooting at my guys, even though he can fully see 4 of my models, I would still get the benefit of cover on this one guy. Now this is the case if it's a singular model, because this one model, this one unit, can fully see this one model. So I don't get cover on this guy, 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 but I do get cover on that guy. However, if we once again trade the Dreadnought out and do the Infiltrators instead, all of these 5 models can see 4 of my models. But the whole unit cannot fully see my unit. And finally, there's one more example. It's a little bit more of a niche case, but it matters for some units. So in this case, Infiltrators, they all have the same weapon, so it doesn't really matter too much. However, let's pretend that this instead was a 1000 Suns unit, right? For 1000 Suns, they usually have quite a lot of different guns in a single unit. And in some situations, they might have, say, their Sorcerer and their heavy bolt gun, whatever it's called, over here, and then some other guys over here who cannot see. So despite the Sorcerer, in this case the Sergeant, and the heavy bolt gun having perfect line of sight of all of my models, because these 2 models cannot see my models, I will get the benefit of cover against these 2 guys' attack. It might seem a little bit backwards, but that is how it works. The final thing we need to cover is partial obscuration. And to do this example, I have some big guys. So we have this Dreadnought, and we have this tank. So right here, it's pretty clear these 2 guys can shoot at each other. However, their models are partially obscured either by the footprint of a ruin or by the ruin itself, and therefore they will get benefit of cover against each other's shooting. If you want to make sure your opponent does not get the benefit of cover, then you need to be able to drag a line from any point of your model that covers every part of your opponent's model without being interrupted. So for the tank, I would probably have to go somewhere like this. So my little stubby leg here sticks out, and I can then draw a line from the stubby leg that covers every single part of his Dreadnought, therefore making sure he does not get the benefit of cover. However, and this is a little bit cheesy, but it is how the rules are written, if my model is like this, as you can see, even though the Dreadnought, let's just have the Dreadnought go here, and we'll do it like this instead actually. This Dreadnought can draw a line of sight from here, and he can see, 95% of my model. However, he cannot see that last little part of my leg over here. And that simply means that I get the benefit of cover. But when I shoot him back, I can see all of his model, therefore he does not get the benefit of cover. And I think that just about covers, well, cover, haha. However, we're not quite done with this video yet, because we have another topic to talk about, and that is visibility. So, as you've just seen, there's a lot of different cases for when you get cover, when you don't get cover, but they all have something in common, and that is that they have something to do with visibility. Visibility in Warhammer is often referred to as line of sight or true visibility. Now, as we discussed, footprints counts as being the start and the end point of a ruin. So it doesn't actually matter what kind of ruin is inside the footprint. As long as you're not inside the footprint or the opponent is not inside the footprint, you cannot see through it. Another new thing that's been added in 10th edition, by most tournaments anyway, is that the ground floor is always treated as being closed. That just means that even if the ruin has windows modeled, or cracks, for the purpose of playing, you treat those walls as being solid. Now, this is very important if you go to a tournament that you check up on what their rules are. Again, 9 out of 10 tournaments in 10th edition will say that the ground floor has closed walls. However, you might be attending a tournament where they're not. And in that case, it's a very good idea to read up on the player pack or ask your tournament organizer. Another thing that's important, not for the footprint, but for the ruins, is to know how tall they are. Because once you enter into the footprint, we now need to talk about true line of sight. And once we start talking about true line of sight, then we start measuring model to model, just like we did when we talked about cover. And that is when things can also get a little bit tricky. So, when you go to tournaments, it's important to ask, first and foremost, are the bottom floor on ruins treated as being closed? And the second part is, are we playing WYSIWYG, that means what you see is what you get, when it comes to the height of the terrain, or do we treat them as being equally tall on all points of the terrain piece? An example I have is that I went to the WTC qualifier here in Denmark, and the rules for that tournament was that even if the ruin physically was only 3 inches tall, we should treat it as being 5 inches tall. Now, the reason why tournaments will introduce these rules, or FAQs, is mostly because the terrain that they use is not equal. Because they have terrain from various editions, or needing to borrow terrain from various players or organizations to be able to set up enough tables. And so it sometimes occurs that they will have a bunch of 3-inch tall ruins, but that the game is intended for 5-inch tall ruins. So it's a good idea to ask if you're playing the terrain as being the height it actually is, or if it's being treated as being a certain amount of height. Now, once again, to talk about visibility, we need to jump into Tabletop Simulator. Alright, visibility. As we just discussed, the footprint of a ruin, while you are outside of it and trying to look at something outside of it, should be treated as being infinitely tall. Even if the walls are over here, and there is no walls in the way between this prosecutor unit and these Infernus Marines, they cannot see each other. That is, once again, because they are both wholly outside of the footprint, and there is no way for them to draw line of sight to each other without crossing over the footprint. Therefore, they cannot see each other. Now, if I have one model wholly within the footprint, I may now, for this one model, measure true line of sight. So this one model can obviously see all of the enemy's models, but these 3 girls cannot see it. So if we combo what we just learned about cover with visibility, you would now know that despite this one model being able to fully see all of these guys, because me as the attacking player, because all of my models cannot see all of any one of his models, he will get the benefit of cover. Now, another thing to remember is that if I'm only partially within the footprint, then I can be seen, but I cannot see. You might think this is a little bit silly, but this is part of trying to fix a bit of the shenanigans that could happen in 9th edition. In 9th edition, we didn't have these footprints, and that meant that if you had a vehicle, like say, my tank over here, if I were to just simply tow on the ruin itself, which is this part, if I were to just tow onto it with a little bit of part of my vehicle, I would now unlock true line of sight, being able to shoot through these windows. So the way they tried to fix this in 10th edition was to say that if you wanted to be able to see through windows, granted, most tournaments play bottom floor as having no windows these days anyway, the only way to be able to do that you would have to be wholly within the ruin. So if, for example, my tank was over here, and the opponent's dreadnought was over here, we would not be able to shoot each other. If I were to put just part of my base inside of the footprint, I would not be able to shoot the dreadnought, but the dreadnought would be able to shoot me. If I were to put my model wholly within the terrain, I can now shoot the dreadnought, and the dreadnought can now shoot me. Another example of windows being closed, remember, is that despite these ruins being modeled with windows, because most tournaments play the bottom floor as being closed, even though that these guys have true line of sight of each other, you need to pretend that there is a solid wall here. And therefore, even though I am wholly within the terrain piece, I cannot shoot at these scouts, and these scouts cannot shoot at me. The reason why my tank can shoot at this Redemptor Dreadnought is because I am wholly within the terrain piece, and I therefore unlock true line of sight. True line of sight is any part of my model to any part of my opponent's model. So I could measure from the very edge of my little tank leg here, and I can see, a large part of my opponent's model. Over here, however, there's a solid wall between my true line of sight. So despite me being able to use true line of sight, there's a solid wall in the way, therefore I cannot see. The final example I need to talk about, and why it's important to ask your tournament on how you treat the height of walls, is that true line of sight obviously also counts for tall models. So let's pretend that my model cannot see this dreadnought through this gap over here. However, if we go to like a ground level look over here, this might not be the greatest example, we'll move it over here instead. You can see that my tank is actually tall enough for a part of its gun to stick up above the ruin. Therefore, I am wholly within the ruin, and therefore I am allowed to use true line of sight to determine visibility. True line of sight, as I just mentioned, is any part of your model to any part of the opposing model. So I can choose to measure from the top of my gun over here and I can see, part of this dreadnought. Therefore, I am allowed to shoot despite having to treat the walls as being solid. Now, the tournament I went to said that we had to treat all parts of the ruin as being 5 inches tall, and so I was not able to do that in that tournament. But if the tournament you play at say that you treat the ruins as being however tall they are, then both the dreadnought and my tank would be able to shoot at each other. This also matters if you bring some models like, say, a Vexilla. Now, I think the Vexilla might be fine here. Oh, actually not. No. So you can see the Vexilla over here. So in theory, if you play ruins as being the height that they are, this dreadnought would be able to shoot at my warden because he can see the flag. And my warden would of course be able to shoot at the dreadnought because my flag is pointing over the wall. So what do I want you to understand from this little example? Visibility is very important because visibility determines cover, but it also determines whether or not you're using true line of sight or if you're being obscured by ruins. Another thing to keep in mind is that true line of sight is the model, not the base. So this dreadnought cannot see the base of my warden over here. However, he can see the spear tip, therefore he can shoot at my wardens. This goes both ways, of course. My spear tip can see this dreadnought, therefore I can shoot the dreadnought. Another example are these containers. These containers do not have a footprint, therefore you use true line of sight. So in theory, now ask your opponent and your TO how you treat this, but in theory, this dreadnought can shoot my warden, and my warden can shoot this dreadnought because there's true line of sight between the gap of the two containers. Now you might ask yourself, well, can my tank shoot at the dreadnought when it's over here? And the answer would be no, because despite me being able to draw a line of sight from, this part of the ruin because I'm tall enough to see over it, I have to pass over another ruin to be able to get the line of sight. Therefore, I am not able to do it. However, if this dreadnought was, say, touching the terrain right here, I would be able to see the dreadnought, because despite the dreadnought not being wholly within the ruin, he is partially within the ruin, and therefore is affected by true line of sight. As I mentioned before, with the Witch Seeker, if you're partially within, you can be seen, but you cannot see. So this dreadnought, I would be able to shoot, but he would not be able to shoot me. And that is why it's very important to remember to always be wholly within terrain or wholly outside of terrain. There is absolutely zero benefit to being partially within terrain. And with that, I think we've covered all we need to cover about terrain rules in 10th edition. This was a long video, but it's a core concept, and that's why I think it's very important to understand. If I messed up somewhere or misexplained something somewhere, feel free to tell it in the comments. This is not meant as a video where I go, oh, you all don't understand how rules work. This is meant to help you. So if I make a mistake, please be sure to correct me in the comments below. But before you correct me, please have the information ready so that when someone asks, oh, how did you come to this conclusion? You can show it. That'll just make it easier for everyone involved. If you'd like to see more core concept videos, then do be sure to tell me in the comments below as well. Thank you so much for watching, and until I see you again, I hope you have a wonderful time.